George Washington was born a long time ago. The year was 1732. The day was February 22nd. He was born in a colony called Virginia. This was before the United States of America existed. Virginia was one of many colonies ruled by Great Britain. George's home was a plantation in Westmoreland County. A plantation is a very large farm. His family's plantation was called Pope's Creek. This farm grew tobacco, which was a very important crop. It was sold to people far away in England. George's life would start here in a world built on farming and land. His parents were Augustine and Mary Ball Washington. Augustine was a landowner and a planter. He was an important man in his community. He owned several farms and businesses. He even had an interest in an iron furnace. This made him a busy and respected person. Augustine had been married before. His first wife passed away, leaving him with 3 children. George was the first child from his second marriage to Mary. Mary Ball Washington was a strong woman. She came from a good family and was known for being very serious and determined. George was a British subject when he was born. Everyone in Virginia was. They followed the laws of the King of England. The Washington family was not among the richest in Virginia, but they were comfortable and well known. They were part of a group called the gentry. These were the landowning families who held power in the colony. Augustine Washington worked hard to improve his family's standing. He wanted his children to have more opportunities than he did. He dreamed of sending his sons to England for school, a common practice for wealthy Virginia families at the time. So George entered a world of ambition and land. His family's position was solid, but not at the very top. This meant that George would have to work to make his own way. He would not inherit a great fortune like some other boys. He grew up hearing about land, about business, and about how to be a leader in Virginia. These early lessons on his family's farm would stay with him. They would shape the man he was to become long before anyone dreamed he would be a general or a president. He was just a boy then, born in a wooden farmhouse near a river. Life on a Virginia plantation was very different from life today. The Washington family lived in a world surrounded by fields and forests. Their home was the center of a busy farming operation. The main work was growing tobacco. This crop took a lot of work to plant, care for, and harvest. Everyone on the plantation had a job to do. The work followed the seasons, from planting in the spring to shipping the dried leaves in the fall. The family's money came from selling this tobacco across the ocean in England. This made them part of a big global trading system. The Washingtons lived a comfortable life. Their house was not a grand mansion like some in Virginia, but it was a good home. They had furniture, dishes, and clothes that were shipped from England. They ate well with food grown right there on the farm. They had gardens for vegetables and orchards for fruit. They also hunted for game, like deer and turkey in the nearby woods. For a young boy like George, the plantation was a huge playground. He learned to ride horses and explore the outdoors. He learned about farming and the rhythm of the land. However, this way of life depended on something very sad. The work on the plantation was done by enslaved people. Augustine Washington owned many slaves. These were men, women, and children of African descent. They were considered property, not people. They were forced to work long hours in the fields and in the house. They had no freedom and no choice. George grew up seeing slavery all around him. It was a normal part of his world. This was a dark reality of colonial Virginia, and it was the foundation of the wealth for families like the Washingtons. George learned many things from this environment. He saw how a large farm was managed. He understood the importance of land and labor. He learned how to give orders and how to manage people, though this was in the context of being a master to slaves. This upbringing made him strong and practical. It taught him to be responsible and to pay attention to details. The plantation was his first school. It taught him about agriculture, business, and the social structure of Virginia. These were lessons that would be very important for his entire life. George Washington did not spend all of his childhood in one place. His family moved several times when he was a young boy. When George was about 3 years old, his father, Augustine, decided to move the family. They left Pope's Creek, the place where George was born. They moved to another property that Augustine owned, This new home was located in Prince William County. It was a plantation that would later be known by a very famous name, Mount Vernon. At the time, it was called Little Hunting Creek Plantation. It was a beautiful spot overlooking the Potomac River. The family did not stay at Little Hunting Creek for very long. After a few years, they moved again. This time, they settled at Ferry Farm. This farm was located near the town of Fredericksburg, Virginia. It was right across the Rappahannock River from the town. This move was probably for business reasons. Augustine Washington had interests in the town and the land was good for farming. Ferry Farm is where George spent most of his boyhood. It was here that many of the famous stories about him, like the one about the cherry tree, are said to have happened, even if they are not true. These moves had a big impact on young George. Each new home was a different world to explore. He had new fields, new woods, and new streams to discover. Moving also meant he was always a little bit of an outsider. He had to get used to new neighbors and new surroundings. This might have made him more independent and self-reliant. He learned to adapt to change from a very young age. He saw his father manage different properties and deal with different challenges. This showed him how to be flexible and resourceful in a changing world. Living at Ferry Farm put George closer to a town. Fredericksburg was a small but busy place. He could see ships on the river and people coming and going. This was different from the more isolated life at Pope's Creek. His father was an important figure in the area, serving as a justice of the peace. George saw his father interacting with other important men. He learned about community life and local politics. This childhood of moving between different estates gave George a broader view of Virginia. He was not just a boy from one farm, but a boy who knew different parts of the colony. George Washington had an older half-brother named Lawrence. George looked up to Lawrence very much. Lawrence was 14 years older than George. He was the son of Augustine Washington and his first wife. To young George, Lawrence seemed like a hero. He was smart, handsome, and well-educated. While George was a young boy growing up on the farm, Lawrence was sent to England for school. This was a great privilege that only the sons of wealthy families could afford. George dreamed of having a life like his brothers. Lawrence came back from England as a refined gentleman. He knew about the world beyond Virginia, but he was not just a scholar, he was also a soldier. He joined the British military to fight in a war against Spain. This war was called the War of Jenkins's Ear. Lawrence was given a commission as a captain. He served in the Caribbean in a campaign against the city of Cartagena. He saw real battles and experienced military life. When he returned to Virginia, he was a decorated war hero. George listened with wide eyes to all of his brother's stories of adventure and combat. Lawrence's military career made a huge impression on George. He saw the respect and honor that his brother received. Lawrence named his new estate on the Potomac River, Mount Vernon. He named it in honor of his commander, Admiral Edward Vernon. This showed George how important military service was. He began to see a military career as a path to glory and success. He wanted to be brave and respected, just like Lawrence. Lawrence became a mentor to George, teaching him about honor, duty, and the ways of a gentleman soldier. After their father, Augustine, died, Lawrence became even more important in George's life. Lawrence took on a fatherly role for his younger brother. He helped guide George's education and career choices. He invited George to stay at Mount Vernon, which was becoming a center for polite society. There, George met influential people and learned important social skills. Lawrence's influence was powerful. It steered George away from a quiet life as a farmer and toward a future filled with public service and military ambition. Lawrence was the role model who set George on his path. So, George Washington did not have the same education as his older brother. When their father, Augustine, died in 1743, George was only 11 years old. The family's plans changed, and there just wasn't enough money to send George to England for a formal education like Lawrence had received. Honestly, this was a big disappointment for George. He always felt a little insecure about his lack of schooling. He saw other important men who could speak Latin and Greek, and had read many classic books. George knew he just couldn't compete with them in that way. Instead of a classical education, George received a practical one. He likely attended a local school run by a man named Reverend James Mary in Fredericksburg. There, he learned the basics, reading, writing, and arithmetic. He was especially good at mathematics. He spent a lot of time practicing his numbers and his handwriting. In fact, he carefully copied out lists of rules for good behavior called the Rules of Civility and Decent Behavior. This really showed his desire to be a proper gentleman, even without a fancy education. He learned what he needed to know for a practical life. His education focused on skills that would be useful in colonial Virginia. For example, he learned how to measure land, which was a very important skill in a place where land meant wealth. He studied geometry and trigonometry, which are types of math used in surveying. He practiced drawing maps and writing legal documents. This was not the education of a scholar who reads poetry. It was the education of a man who would work with his hands and his mind to build a fortune. He was learning how to be a man of business and action, not a man of letters. This lack of formal schooling shaped George in important ways. It made him very hard-working and disciplined. He knew he had to make up for his disadvantage through constant self-improvement. He read books on his own, especially books about military strategy and agriculture. He learned by doing and by observing others. His practical education prepared him perfectly for the challenges he would face. He might not have been able to quote ancient philosophers, but he knew how to lead men, manage an estate, and navigate the wilderness. His education was not traditional, but it was exactly what he needed. George's relationship with his mother, Mary Ball Washington, was complicated. After his father died, Mary was left to raise George and his younger siblings on her own. She was a strong and protective mother, always worrying about her children and wanting to keep them safe. Mary was, very cautious, especially about money and risk. She managed Ferry Farm by herself, which was a difficult job for a widow. She taught George the importance of hard work and responsibility. However, she could also be demanding and often disagreed with George's ambitions. Mary did not want George to follow in Lawrence's footsteps. When George was 14, he had a chance to join the British Royal Navy. This was a wonderful opportunity arranged by Lawrence and his influential friends. A life at sea could lead to a great career, and George was very excited about the idea. But his mother said no. She did not want her oldest son to go so far away and face such dangers. She was afraid for him. This was a major turning point. George obeyed his mother's wishes, but he was deeply disappointed. He had to find another path for himself. In contrast, his bond with Lawrence was all about ambition and looking outward. Lawrence encouraged George's dreams and saw potential in his younger brother. He invited George to live with him at Mount Vernon, which was a different world from the simple life at Ferry Farm. At Mount Vernon, George was surrounded by important people like the powerful Fairfax family who lived nearby. Lawrence taught George how to behave in polite society, how to dance, how to talk to important guests, and how to act like a gentleman. Lawrence was opening doors for George that his mother wanted to keep closed. This pull between his mother's caution and his brother's ambition defined George's youth. He loved and respected his mother, but he yearned for the adventure and honor that Lawrence represented. He wanted more than just the life of a small farmer, which seemed to be what his mother envisioned for him. So he chose to follow the path that Lawrence showed him. This meant leaving Ferry Farm and his mother's direct influence behind. He moved toward the world of the Virginia gentry, a world of land, politics, and military service. This was his first big step toward becoming his own man. With a career in the Navy no longer an option, George needed to find another way to make a living. His skills in mathematics pointed him toward a promising profession: land surveying. In colonial Virginia, land was everything. People were constantly buying, selling, and claiming new land on the frontier. A surveyor was a person who measured that land. They created official maps and marked property boundaries. It was a respected and well-paying job, and really it was also a way for a young man without a large inheritance to acquire land and wealth for himself. George's connection to the powerful Fairfax family was a great help. Lord Fairfax was one of the wealthiest men in Virginia and owned a huge amount of land in the northern part of the colony. Through his brother Lawrence, who was married to a Fairfax, George got an amazing opportunity. In 1748, when he was just 16 years old, George was invited to join a surveying party. They were heading into the Shenandoah Valley to measure Lord Fairfax's lands. This was a true adventure. It was George's first trip into the wild frontier of Virginia. The journey was difficult and taught George many lessons. He slept outdoors, often on the cold ground. He crossed swollen rivers and climbed steep mountains. He met settlers living in rough log cabins and encountered Native American groups. He learned how to be tough and self-sufficient. He had to be precise in his work, even in bad weather and difficult terrain. This experience was more valuable than any school lesson. It hardened him physically and mentally, and it also gave him a deep understanding and love for the American wilderness. The trip was a great success. George proved that he was a skilled and reliable surveyor. The very next year, at the age of 17, he was appointed as the official surveyor for Culpeper County. This was a real public office, a remarkable achievement for someone so young. For the next few years, George worked hard, saving his money and buying his own land with the fees he earned. The work took him all over the frontier. It made him independent, gave him a good income, and made him an expert on the western lands. This knowledge would become very important later in his life. Lawrence Washington, George's beloved brother and mentor, had always struggled with his health. He had a disease called tuberculosis which affected his lungs. In the hopes of finding a cure, Lawrence decided to travel to the warmer climate of Barbados in the Caribbean. In 1751, he asked George, who was then 19, to go with him. This was George's first and only trip outside of the American colonies, and it was a difficult journey. While in Barbados, George caught smallpox. He survived the disease, but it left him with scars on his face for the rest of his life. Sadly, the trip did not help Lawrence. His health did not improve. He returned to Virginia, knowing he was dying. In the summer of 1752, Lawrence Washington passed away at Mount Vernon. He was only 34 years old. This was a terrible loss for George. He had lost his brother, his friend, and his guide. Lawrence's death marked the end of George's youth. He was now truly on his own, and he had to take on new and much bigger responsibilities. The world he had known with Lawrence at its center was gone forever. In his will, Lawrence made a generous arrangement. He left his estate, Mount Vernon, to his wife for her lifetime. After her, it would pass to their only child, a daughter named Sarah. But the will also said that if Sarah died without children, Mount Vernon would go to George. Tragically, little Sarah died just 2 years after her father. Lawrence's widow, Anne, eventually remarried and decided to lease the Mount Vernon property. She leased it to the person who loved it most, her brother-in-law, George Washington. So, in 1754, at the age of 22, George Washington became the master of Mount Vernon. He took over the management of the plantation that he had always admired. It was a huge responsibility. He had to manage the land, the crops, and the many enslaved people who lived and worked there. Mount Vernon became his home, his passion, and his project for the rest of his life. He expanded the house and improved the farms. Inheriting Mount Vernon elevated his social status. It made him an important landowner, fulfilling the dream that Lawrence had helped to build. And Lawrence had not only been a soldier, but also a senior officer in the Virginia militia. After he died, his position was divided into 4 districts. George wanted to follow in his brother's footsteps. Using his connections, he asked for one of the positions. In late 1752, the governor appointed him as a major in the Virginia militia. He was only 20 years old and had no military experience at all, but he was ambitious and eager to learn. He began to read books on military tactics and strategy, and he was ready for a chance to prove himself as a soldier, just like Lawrence. His chance came sooner than he expected. Both the British and the French claimed ownership of a vast area of land west of the Appalachian Mountains. This area was called the Ohio Country. The French had started building forts there to control the region. The governor of Virginia, Robert Dinwiddie, needed to send a message to the French. He needed to tell them to leave the land, which he said belonged to Britain. It was a dangerous mission through hundreds of miles of winter wilderness. The governor chose the new young Major George Washington for the job. In the late fall of 1753, Washington set out on his long journey. He traveled with a small group, including a skilled frontiersman named Christopher Gist. They faced terrible weather, including snow and freezing rain. They met with Native American leaders to ask for their support. Finally, they reached the French fort. The French commander was polite but firm. He refused to leave. He said the land belonged to France. Washington returned to Virginia with the French reply. His detailed journal of the trip was published and made him famous throughout the colonies and even in London. He was seen as a brave and capable young man. The governor was not happy with the French response. He decided to use force. He promoted Washington to lieutenant colonel and sent him back to the Ohio country with a small force of soldiers. Their mission was to build a fort and defend British claims. In May 1754, Washington's men ambushed a small French scouting party, killing their commander. This small fight in the woods was the first shot of a huge conflict, the French and Indian War. A larger French force soon surrounded Washington and his men at a small, hastily built fort they called Fort Necessity. Outnumbered and defeated, Washington was forced to surrender. It was a humiliating start to his military career, but it was just the beginning.